So I'm not quite sure sort of where he's getting this confidence and some of this professionalism and some of this court sense, but this kid has got it.
That's silly.
That's a better start than Novak, Alcaraz, Sinner, and Fonseca.
2 weeks ago, Rafael Jodar didn't exist in the mainstream conversation. Now he's a Madrid Open quarter-finalist who dismantled the world number 8 in under an hour, 6-2, 6-2, against de Minaur on the biggest clay stage outside Roland Garros. Tennis experts watched that match, and then they said something that should make every Alcaraz fan deeply uncomfortable. What they finally exposed is the part nobody in mainstream media wanted to say directly. Alcaraz keeps failing, not because he's lost his talent, but because someone younger just showed up doing what Alcaraz used to do before all the noise started. Jodar is 19. His coach is his father.
But he's there as coached by his dad.
There's no contract dispute, no family politics, no 48-hour signing ultimatum handed to a legend who coached him for 7 years. No coaching transition 4 months before the biggest clay stretch of the calendar, no wrist injury forcing him out of Roland Garros. The tournament Alcaraz won in 2024, won again in 2025, and won't even enter in 2026. The contrast is uncomfortable to look at directly. The real reason is not what the headlines suggest. It's worse. Subscribe before we get into it. This one goes places most channels won't touch. Let's start with what the experts actually said, because the framing matters before anything else lands correctly. Kim Clijsters went on the Love All podcast and said Jodar is already executing the one tactical quality that separates the sport's genuine elite from everyone chasing them. Playing through the court with extreme simultaneous pressure on both serve and return. Not one dimension, both. At 19, against top 10 competition on the biggest clay stage outside Paris. Boris Becker watched the Madrid run and called him a diamond. Andy Roddick gave his public endorsement without hesitation. And Alcaraz himself, the player whose name sits at the center of this conversation, looked at everything Jodar did in Madrid and said the rise was not surprising at all. Sit with that. The player being described as failing called another teenager's explosive ascent completely expected. That is either a generous read on a rival or a deeply self-aware admission about what the sport can produce when the conditions are right. Either way, it tells you something worth paying attention to before we go any further. Now go back to December 13th, 2025. A contract was placed in front of Juan Carlos Ferrero, the man who had coached Alcaraz since he was 15 years old, the man who won ATP Coach of the Year twice during their time together. The architect behind 6 Grand Slam titles, 3 of which came on clay, the surface Alcaraz was built to dominate. The contract arrived with one condition attached: sign within 48 hours. Ferrero didn't sign, he walked. The official split was announced on December 16th. Clean on the surface, mutual respect, gratitude for the journey. The standard language these situations produce when two parties agree to present things neatly. But underneath the statement, the story was considerably messier. Sources close to the situation reported to multiple outlets that significant disagreements had been accumulating between Ferrero and Alcaraz's father over how to manage the player's career.
Las cosas a nivel de contratos, habían ciertas cosas que no estábamos de acuerdo.
Not a sudden rupture, a slow pressure build over months that had been visible to people inside the team long before any contract appeared on a table. The 48-hour ultimatum wasn't the origin point of the breakdown. It was the final weight applied to something that had already been fracturing beneath the surface for some time. Ferrero went to Marca afterward and described the split as a deep wound. He said he poured his soul into the project. He gave everything he had. He admitted he still thinks about Alcaraz on a daily basis and said coaching someone else right now would feel impossible, because his heart, in his own words, was still there. This is not the language of someone who experienced a clean, professional transition. It is the language of someone who lost something fundamental and hasn't finished processing what that means. Think carefully about what that represents structurally for Alcaraz, the man who had guided him through every significant developmental and competitive moment of his career. Gone. 7 years of accumulated knowledge about how this specific player thinks, how he responds to adversity mid-match, which tactical adjustments land in the third set of a Grand Slam final versus which ones need to be planted in. The warm-up 3 days earlier. All of that replaced by Samuel Lopez, a capable coach who had only been integrated into the team setup since December 2024. Less than a year of genuine relationship depth before the most demanding stretch of the entire tennis calendar began. That gap matters enormously, and it is underappreciated in most coverage of what followed. Clay season in Europe is not a forgiving environment for transition periods. It demands tactical precision, deep physical trust between player and coaching staff, and a shared decision-making language that takes years of real competition to build properly. Lopez inherited a situation already carrying significant weight before a single ball was struck in 2026. And then the Australian Open happened. January 2026. Alcaraz won it, completed the career Grand Slam at 22 years old, the youngest man in history to do so, under Lopez. On a surface he had never won a major on before, genuinely historic, undeniable proof that whatever fractured in December hadn't destroyed the capacity for peak performance when the competitive conditions and mental alignment came together correctly. But then came the clay, and the picture shifted in a different direction entirely. Monte Carlo was first. Alcaraz reached the final. He faced Jannik Sinner. He led by a break in the first set. He led by a break in the second set. He accumulated 45 unforced errors across the match. He double faulted on a set point. He lost. His own words in the press conference afterward were precise and brutally self-aware. The important moments, the important points, he didn't play well. Not a complaint about conditions, not a reference to physical problems. A direct acknowledgement that when the match demanded the clearest head, something got in the way of delivering it. That is not the language of a player experiencing a technical breakdown in their game. That is the language of a player who understands exactly what keeps happening and has not yet found the mechanism to interrupt it. The awareness is completely intact. The execution under maximum pressure is not arriving when the situation demands it most. Barcelona came next. He picked up a wrist injury during the tournament, pulled out mid-competition. The diagnosis that followed was significant: tendon inflammation and cartilage damage. Not the kind of injury that resolves itself with a week of rest. Pulled out of Madrid, pulled out of Rome, then came the confirmation that made the full picture unavoidable. Withdrawn from Roland Garros 2026, the tournament he won in 2024, won again in 2025. Back-to-back titles on the surface built specifically for his game. He will not enter it this year. Approximately 3,000 ranking points disappearing from his total. The clay season he was supposed to own completely, gone. Now here is precisely where Rafael Jodar enters this story. Not as a cause of what happened to Alcaraz, but as a mirror that makes what happened impossible to look away from. Jodar was born September 17, 2006. His father played basketball competitively and spent his professional life teaching physical education. He taught his son tennis. There was no famous academy involvement, no IMG pipeline, no brand architecture assembled around a high-value prospect, no family management team negotiating contracts with coaches. Just a father who understood athletic development, understood his son's specific capabilities, and built something from the ground up that eventually became genuinely dangerous at the highest level of professional tennis. On December 31st, 2025, New Year's Eve, Jodar turned professional. 13 months before that date, he was ranked number 908 in the world and enrolled as a college freshman at the University of Virginia. The distance between those coordinates and a number 34 career-high ranking in May 2026 should not be processed as a charming sports story. It should be processed as a data point that demands explanation. 3 challenger titles in 2025, Australian Open qualifier in January 2026, first ATP title in Marrakesh in April 2026, Barcelona Open semifinals, Madrid Masters quarterfinals, first top 10 win, de Minaur 6-2, 6-2 before his 20th birthday. The de Minaur result specifically deserves more examination than it typically gets. Alex de Minaur at the time of that match was the world number 8. He is one of the most physically relentless competitors on the tour, a retriever with exceptional defensive Capacity, the kind of player who converts attrition into victories and wins matches by making opponents feel like every point costs more than it should. 6-2. 6-2 is not a narrow competitive defeat. It is a scoreline that says one player had no answer for what the other was doing from the first game to the last. Jodar didn't find a way to survive de Minaur. He made de Minaur look like he didn't belong in the same match. What Kleisters identified on that podcast is visible when you study the footage with attention. Jodar doesn't play with the goal of neutralizing his opponent's strengths. He plays to impose his own conditions from the opening point. The serve generates pressure. The return generates pressure. There is no phase of the point where he shifts into a passive holding pattern and waits for a mistake. He builds the pressure until the mistake becomes inevitable. That is not a young player's instinct. That is a mature tactical identity operating at a level most players his age haven't developed yet. Jodar mentioned after the Madrid run that Rafa Nadal's approach to competition shaped how he thinks about being present during a match. He said Nadal taught him to stay there for every single moment the match brings you. He watches chess videos specifically to develop his strategic pattern recognition. And Alcaraz, in his own words describing Jodar on court, said he plays with no fear and no respect for anybody. He was not being critical, he was being precise. That quality, fearlessness as a functional competitive state, rather than as a personality trait, is the thing that runs through every meaningful description of Jodar's tennis. And it is the thing that keeps surfacing in every meaningful analysis of where Alcaraz's game becomes unreliable. Go back to Monte Carlo, leading in both sets against the world number 1. 45 unforced errors, a double fault on set point. Sinner won without playing his best tennis because Alcaraz kept handing points back at the moments where keeping them would have changed everything. This is not about physical quality or technical deficiency. This is about what happens in the mental architecture of a match when the weight of what it means to win or lose becomes louder than the tactical clarity needed to do either. This pattern was not born at Monte Carlo. In early 2025, Alcaraz lost in the first round of Miami to David Goffin, 34 years old, ranked 55th. Multiple commentators reached for the word crisis without hesitation. He then lost in the second round at Paris to Cameron Norrie, lost to Taylor Fritz at the Laver Cup, which had never happened in any previous meeting between them. Got beaten by Sinner at the ATP Finals. Each individual result has an explanation. The accumulation of results at specific pressure points does not. Ferrero understood those pressure points with a precision nobody else in Alcaraz's current team has had time to develop. 7 consecutive years of working with a player means building a real-time map of exactly where the mental structure needs reinforcement before a match begins. Understanding which adjustments land during a second set changeover versus which ones need to be seeded in practice 2 days before the tournament. Understanding when silence from the coaching box does more than any tactical signal ever could. That depth of knowledge cannot be written into a transition brief and handed to a successor. It accumulates inside the relationship itself. When the relationship ends, the knowledge doesn't transfer cleanly. Lopez is doing the work. The Australian Open result is not nothing. It demonstrates the ceiling remains extraordinary when the conditions align. But ceiling and floor are different structural questions. The ceiling shows what is possible under optimal conditions. The floor shows what holds when the conditions become hostile and the pressure is at its absolute maximum. This clay season has been a floor test. The floor gave way. Jodar's story runs in the opposite direction along almost every structural axis. His father coaches him. The person with the deepest knowledge of who he is as a competitor and as a person is the same person making decisions about his tennis. There is no separation between those two roles, creating space for conflict, misalignment, or the kind of family tension that reportedly contributed to the fracture between Ferrero and the Alcaraz camp. There is no contract with a 48-hour deadline. There is no deep wound requiring public processing in a national newspaper. There is a father and a son and a working method that has taken a player from 908 in the world to the quarterfinals of a Masters 1000 event in 13 months. What that working method produced in Madrid was not an accident of draw luck or a favorable surface condition. Jodar beat Fonseca before de Minaur. João Fonseca, another teenage sensation, Brazilian, heavily hyped, someone the tour had already circled as a future top 10 fixture. Jodar dispatched him without drama. Then came de Minaur. Then a quarterfinal against the world number 1 that Sinner won, but did not coast through. 3 consecutive matches at a Masters 1000 event, each one against a player with legitimate credentials, none of them treated by Jodar as anything other than a problem to solve on the day. That is not a hot week. That is a competitive temperament revealing itself under sustained pressure across multiple rounds. Nobody serious is arguing that simplicity of structure is automatically superior at the elite level. Alcaraz's setup produced 7 Grand Slam titles before the age of 23. The complexity was functional for years because the central coaching relationship held it together. The experts are not making a case for dismantling the machine. They are pointing at what happens when the central load-bearing element of that machine is removed abruptly, in contested circumstances, 4 months before the most important stretch of the calendar. There's also a generational dimension to this story that most coverage skips past in favor of the coaching drama. Jodar is part of a wave of teenagers currently arriving on the professional tour with a different relationship to pressure than the generation that preceded them. Fonseca is part of it. Lerner Tien is part of it. These players grew up watching Alcaraz and Sinner dominate at 19 and 20, which means the psychological ceiling they inherited was already set at a different altitude. They do not arrive on a Grand Slam or Masters court believing the occasion is too large for them. They arrive believing the occasion is exactly the right size. Jodar sits at the most advanced position of that wave right now, and the Madrid run was the clearest evidence yet that the wave is genuinely arriving. Jodar, in the same week the Roland Garros withdrawal was confirmed, was on that same Madrid clay making Sinner work in a quarterfinal. Sinner won because Sinner is world number 1 and the best player currently alive. But Jodar made him earn it, at 19. With his father in the coaching box watching every point, the experts, Kleisters, Becker, Roddick, and others speaking with slightly more caution in background conversations, are not writing Alcaraz off. That would be an absurd misreading of someone who completed the career Grand Slam at 22. What they are doing is something more specific and more challenging to sit with comfortably. They are pointing at the quality that defined Alcaraz, at his most dangerous, and noting that right now it is more visible in someone who has none of the structural complications, none of the history, and none of the accumulated weight of being the most scrutinized young player in tennis. The uncomfortable parallel is this: when Alcaraz first appeared on the tour and started producing results that made established players look like they were playing a slightly different sport, the word people reached for consistently was fearless. He played with a disregard for the significance of the moment that made watching him feel different from watching anyone else at that age. That quality was not manufactured by a coaching system or a brand strategy. It came from somewhere internal, and the question that nobody wants to ask directly, but that the experts are circling with increasing frequency, is whether the weight of everything that has accumulated around Alcaraz's career since then has made that internal quality harder to access when it matters most. Alcaraz will return from this wrist injury. He will compete at the highest level again. The talent has not gone anywhere and the ceiling is not in question. But the clay season of 2026 will be remembered as the period when a 19-year-old with a PE teacher for a coach made the contrast between what Alcaraz is and what he could still become impossible to ignore. Not by beating him, but simply by showing up and playing the way Alcaraz plays when everything is working and nothing is in the way. That is the uncomfortable truth the experts finally exposed. And the reason it landed so hard is because it came from the right place at exactly the right time. If this gave you a perspective worth thinking about, subscribe and turn the notifications on. The next breakdown is already in production, and it goes even deeper into what is genuinely shifting at the top of men's tennis right now.